Hello, and welcome to the latest presentation of the Friends of History's First Wednesday Lecture Series. I'm Kathleen Daggett with the Friends of History, and I will be your host today. These monthly lectures are provided free of charge by the Friends of History of the New Mexico History Museum and through donations from our audience. We do accept and encourage donations. Your contributions directly support the lecture series and, more importantly, programs and exhibits at the New Mexico History Museum. Should you wish to give a gift, any amount is appreciated. Please go to our website and click on the donate button at the top of the page. Our speaker today is Alison Griffiths, Distinguished Professor of Film and Media Study at Baruch College, City University of New York, and at the CUNY Graduate Center. Dr. Griffiths will be speaking today about cultural memory and amateur film, the visual legacy of the Gallup Inter-Tribal Indian Ceremonial, exploring the vibrant history of the ceremonial from its inauguration in 1922 to the early 1940s. Dr. Griffiths has examined a treasure trove of materials, a selection of which she will share today to transport us into the rich history of the ceremonial. In particular, she analyzed a collection of amateur films of the ceremonial made in the 1920s and 30s by American geologist William Rather. This lecture is being delivered in partnership with the New Mexico History Museum. It aligns with the museum's exhibition, Honoring Tradition and Innovation, 100 Years of Santa Fe's Indian Market, 1922 to 2022. The Gallup Inter-Tribal Ceremonial began at the same time as Santa Fe's Indian Market in 1922, so both celebrated their centennial in 2022. Dr. Alison Griffiths is an internationally recognized scholar and author of several award-winning books, as well as over 50 journal articles and book chapters. She is considered an expert on the history of ethnographic film. Her research has been supported by a Guggenheim Fellowship and numerous grants. Earlier this year, she completed a residence as a Fulbright Distinguished Chair in Arctic Studies in Norway, where she researched early film of Indigenous Sami at the National Library of Norway. She received her PhD from New York University, currently teaches film history, visual studies, and media theory at City University of New York. Her latest book, Nomadic Cinema, A Cultural Geography of the Expedition Film, is forthcoming from Columbia University Press. And now let's welcome Dr. Alison Griffiths.
Thank you, Kathleen, for that very gracious introduction. I'm honored to be here to share my research on the Inter-Tribal Indian Ceremonial with you. And I hope you enjoy my talk. I will get started and share my screen. Okay. So this talk considers amateur films made in the first third of the 20th century as an important site of Native American audiovisual cultural heritage, a space of reclamation, memory, and possibility for Native peoples. It's part of a multinational project involving archival research on the earliest amateur films made of Indigenous peoples in 3 settler colonial contexts: Native Americans in the American Southwest, the subject of my talk today, Indigenous Australians, and Sami peoples from the northern Scandinavian Sapmi region of Norway, Sweden, and Finland. In each of these case studies, I explore how amateur film can be repatriated, reimagined, and re-cared for within Indigenous systems of knowledge, part of an international effort to decolonize the archive through new archival protocols, metadata, and digital access. In each of these national contexts, I explore 3 questions. First, how can cinema help construct a more nuanced story, a complex story of entangled settler colonial histories, one in which indigeneity is foregrounded? 2, how can these films be returned to communities so that their knowledge becomes central in making sense of cultural memory? And 3, how can the archive be reimagined as a caretaker of Indigenous visual history, a repository of cultural memory and a site of creative possibility for contemporary media artists? My talk focuses on 2 amateur films from the early 20s-30s made by amateur geologist, former director of the US Geological Survey, and part-time New Mexico resident William Embry Rather, at the Inter-Tribal Indian Ceremonial held in Gallup, as a site of Indigenous history and memory making. Beginning in the summer of 1922, the annual ceremonial was and remains a celebration of Native American dance, visual, and material culture, taking place over several days each August, and except for a few brief hiatuses, has been held continuously for a century. Let's just look at a snippet of footage that I shot at last year's 2022 ceremonial. Beginning in the summer of 1922, the annual ceremonial was and remains an important celebration. And as I said, it's been held with just a few breaks around World War II since 1922. Gallup holds onto ceremonial as a powerful symbol of Native American resilience and self-determination, even though its genesis is bound up with majority culture exploitation of Indigenous culture against the backdrop of genocide and racism. Ceremonial is Gallup, the two entities imbricated in a web of civic, spiritual, commercial, and touristic activities and priorities, including state bureaucracies as well as the Navajo Nation. Visual history is celebrated in Gallup's architecture, with 20 murals of the city's cultural past filling public walls, many of them dating to the WPA New Deal Public Arts Project and filled with problematic imagery, a constant reminder of Gallup's history as a represented space. Gallup also supported a photographic infrastructure of camera shops, such as William, known locally as Tom Malarkey's outfit, located on 2nd Street in Gallup, and George Height's camera store. Malarkey produced a large corpus of photographs of ceremonial from its inauguration through the 1930s and 40s, and is privately owned by the Guadagnoli family that bought the business in 1960. My goal is to pick apart some of the tightly woven assumptions about ethnic tourism marking the ceremonial, to consider whether amateur film might be surprisingly well equipped to evoke a sense of collective as well as individual Indigenous memory. I'm interested in exploring whether the structure and tonal shifts of Rather's Gallup films, the fact that the material from ceremonial in the films is bracketed by footage of Rather's family, depicted both on his property and in public spaces with other tourists, reveals as much about Rather's license to imagine, both himself and his relationship to American Indians, as it does the Native American parades, dances, foot and horse races that we see in the ceremonial footage. I also examine amateur filmmaking of the ceremonial as a catalyst for recuperating Native American history more concretely. Since I returned Rather's films, along with a few others of ceremonial from the same era, to the Octavia Fellon Public Library in Gallup, and screened them as part of oral history interviews I conducted with members of the Dene and Hopi tribes and other ceremonial stakeholders. Returning an amateur film back to its community of origin, part of a Making It Right initiative, is one small but vital step in decolonizing the film archive, shifting the emphasis away from the visual text as a locus of meaning and including Indigenous stakeholders as vital interlocutors. I conclude with a discussion of this repatriation process, how the films functioned as mediated memories for Indigenous people, as well as questions of community engagement. Part 1, a unique and novel entertainment, genesis of the Inter-Tribal Indian Ceremonial. How ceremonial ended up in Gallup, a city with a population of only 5,500 in 1922, is a story of geography, commerce, opportunism, and community organization, affecting the lives of the Dene, by far the largest group, Zuni, Hopi, Pueblos, Apache peoples, as well as Hispanic and Anglo community members. Gallup was an important trading center with an estimated 30,000 Native Americans involved in transactions of some kind, as well as an important stop on the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railway, advertised by George Crawford in his compendious Transcontinental Tourist Guide. A poster promoting tourism to Gallup as the so-called Indian capital encapsulates the dominant discourses shaping the growth of modern tourism in the region. A native man stands on a remote clifftop staring across the frame while shielding his eyes from the sun. As prominent as the man, barely visible in the midground, on the right is an American Indian settlement. As prominent as the man in the poster is the wide white road with a single car that wends its way into the distance. The connection between the man and the road is quite simple. One will bring you access to the other, although the fact that his gaze transcends the road offers the possibility for a more nuanced reading of the impact of tourism upon Indigenous communities. The poster for the third ceremonial in 1924 not only maximizes the visual appeal of the ochre red landscape as an overarching design concept, but imagines ceremonial as a pilgrimage-like experience for the Indigenous participants, who, walking from deep in the mountains, recede as far as the eye can see. In embryonic form, the ceremonial was conceived as a so-called Indian Day by Mike Kirk, who floated the idea of an annual day or pageant celebrating Indian life, arguing that would increase the number of tourists passing through Gallup and bolster the local economy. Kirk, who owned the trading post at Manuelita, 18 miles west of Gallup, came from a long line of Indian traders and was something of an impresario, taking groups of Native American dancers, runners, artists, and craftspeople with him to regional and national conventions. Despite opposition by some Gallup residents who viewed the enterprise as nothing more than a get-rich-quick scheme launched by money-grubbing white traders, neither the Gallup Chamber of Congress nor the Kiwanis Club agreed to sponsor it the first year. Several early skeptics went on to become significant ceremonial directors, and the event grew into a 3-day celebration that became a 10-day version for the ceremonial in 1922. From the start, however, certain members of the Navajo and Pueblo communities voiced concern about the appropriateness of including sacred dances, and different tribes weighed in on the pros and cons based on prevailing attitudes towards the private nature of their religious practices. A discourse raised in the oral histories I conducted with community members, and that I will return to later in the lecture. The first ceremonial took place September 28th through 30th, 1922, and consisted of a parade, day and evening dances, Yebiche, Fire, Chaleco, Comanche, Buffalo, Eager, Butterfly, and War, according to the program. A rodeo, wrestling matches, a chicken pull competition on horseback, and 2 tents that served as exhibit halls organized by Dene, Pueblo, Apache, and Ute peoples. In unapologetically assimilationist rhetoric, the program touted the paternalism of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, while also promoting the unique topography of the region where, quote, nature had indulged in her most weird pranks. In 1923, for the second ceremonial, Kirk arranged for over 400 First Nations people to dance, adding representatives from the Acoma, Laguna, San Juan, Taos, Sal Ildefonso, and Cochiti tribes, as well as the famous Princess Cianina, who is Muskogee Cianina Red Feather Blackstone, who sang each afternoon and evening. By 1937, Plains groups, including the Wind River, Arapaho Shoshone, and the Oklahoma Kiowa, made the trek to Gallup. Part 2, the liminality of the home movie. Whose stories, memories are these? Amateur film, with its feet in both public and private worlds, stands precariously on the threshold of social reality, oscillating between private family moments occurring in public and public moments with no private valence except for Rather's status as a tourist snap shooter. And what we're looking at here are the opening moments of Rather's late 1920s home movie footage. Rather's training as a surveyor might have shaped the decision-making in terms of choosing what to shoot. And while we can never know what he was thinking, the opening sequence of the black and white late 1920s footage offers a tangible sense of the shared social realities of Native Americans and rather as a representative of the majority culture. I'm just going to let this play out a little bit longer. You may have noticed that right after the opening sheep sequence, when we cut to a shot of Rather's entourage, we see his wife, two daughters, and unidentified family members or friends taking a break in the shade. We see several Indigenous people in the group. A small detail to be sure, but nevertheless recognition of the Southwestern economy as a space of colonial entanglement. The Native Americans are separated from the extended Rather group and yet paradoxically embedded, reflecting the political economy of the tourist industry, as well as something more ineffable, a hint of engagement, conversation, and interdependency that is missing from the them and us visual logic of the ceremonial footage. Not surprisingly, Rather shot copious footage of the famous parade, one of the most visually striking features of the ceremonial, capturing it from 3 locations around town. He's close to the performers in each of the camera setups. Although being on the street, he's also subject to unexpected intrusions, as when a boy pops into the frame and stares straight into Rather's lens. Most of his footage, however, is shot from a 200-foot, 1,500-seat capacity grandstand and 300-seat bleachers constructed at Lyon Memorial Park. Rather has excellent sight lines of the performers, and his camera work is solid. Indeed, as amateur film scholar Patricia Zimmerman notes, by the 1920s, an ideology of professionalism had infused all levels of amateur filmmaking. Bell and Howell's slogan for the film camera was professional accuracy with amateur ease. And in appealing to both male and female amateur filmmakers, advertisements depicted women operating cameras in their role as family chroniclers. Little distinguishes Rather's film from professionally shot footage. There were plans for Fox News Service International to film the ceremonial in 1924, and officials purportedly reorganized the schedule so that the most visually entertaining elements would be staged during the day. Although there are moments when we can see that clearly Rather is an amateur and has to shoot behind the very large Stetson of someone sitting smack bang in front of him, something that would have been edited out of commercial newsreel. Rather than view these moments as mistakes or glitches, though, I want to argue that their reflexive quality, their acknowledgement of the ceremonial as a space of reciprocal looking, of shared memory formation in celebration of key moments of tribal life, opens a back door into its history, as told through visual images. For example, settled into a shooting location in the grandstand, having filmed marches, dancers, and runners, a cross-section of typical afternoon activities, a group of Hopi Eagle dancers standing at the edge of the bleachers suddenly catches Rather's eye, And in an unlikely move, he pans his camera left to show us not only the dancers, but also an Anglo man sitting right next to him, filming, a mirror image of Rather, and a reflexive reminder that he was by no means alone in chronicling the event. The fact that there were not one but two cameras next to each other on the bleachers is hardly surprising, given the popularity of amateur filmmaking at the time, and the ledge to locate the camera also made it a desirable location. Perhaps emboldened by his decision to survey his surroundings, Rather tilts his camera over the edge of the bleachers to film a Dene man dressed in black and wearing a large silver belt and necklace sitting on the ground at the edge of the bleachers. Possibly, as one of the oral history participants suggested, an intermediary coordinating between the ceremonial board and the tribal groups. Seizing upon an opportunity to film the man for a second time, Rather gets a shot of him walking, the man's eyes fixed on the camera as he traverses from one side of the shoreground to the other. This sequence with the Dene man might be read as a contrapuntal moment of heightened social power, his return gaze underscoring voyeurism, but also the Dene man's agency. Rather's camera looks at him as someone with authority and status, transforming this cross-cultural encounter into a fascinating moment of counter-history. The fact that Rather seeks out unstructured moments of the Gallup celebrations rather than postcard-ready official renditions provides an entry point into reconsidering the value of amateur film in giving visibility to more subtle social realities and Indigenous agency. Gallup's history is enshrined in the countless private photographs taken by ceremonial's visitors across a century, as seen in this road trip photo album entitled Summer of 1927 via Colorado Springs to New Mexico, housed at the Palace of the Governor's Archive at the New Mexico History Museum. In a final flurry of filming, in which Rather edits in the camera, he records the rodeo, more dancing, a tug of war, and dramatic nighttime dances and singing around a bonfire. Pretty much everything included in this flyer of things seen at the Indian Ceremonial from the late 20s, 30s. Footage of Zuni Ola maidens carrying decorated pots on their heads appears in both Rather's film and in a film called Camping Among the Indians, made in 1927 by American Museum of Natural History curator Clyde Fisher and founder of the Woodcraft League and the American Boy Scouts, Ernest Seton Thompson. That also contains ceremonial footage that I showed to some of my respondents. I write about this film at length in my book, Nomadic Cinema, a cultural geography of the expedition film that Kathleen mentioned in her introduction that's forthcoming. And in the clip I'm about to show, take a look at the very end where you notice someone with a motion picture camera filming the Ola maidens. It's a wonderful reminder of the event as this kind of hyper-visualized space. Let's just take a look. This was a co-sponsored expedition by the American Museum of Natural History and the Woodcraft League. And even though it's made roughly at the exact same time as Rather, you can see by the quality of the footage that it's been better preserved and looks a little bit more polished. And there's the cinematographer behind the tripod that I mentioned. At least I'm assuming it's a cinematographer, not a photographer. Rather films several more dances by different tribes dressed in regalia and headdresses, some of the competitions, and the parade wending its way through Gallup streets, ending up back in the bleachers, except having forfeited his front row seat for a location much further back and with an obstructed view. Rather revisits two earlier motives in the closing scenes before a final dance, and then returns to sheep and his family. Odd juxtapositions of children playing, cliff dwellings, grumpy-looking women holding children, adobe architecture, and a campfire scene suggest a restless gaze that comes in part from the hybrid nature of the film, both a chronicle of a family vacation and a visual diary of Rather's experience of ceremonial. Public and private memories are juxtaposed in the opening and closing sequences of the film, as if Rather's memories were so tightly imbricated that it took the film itself to parse out specific moments aggregated as part of his life history in New Mexico. Part 3, Parades and Dances in Color. Rather also made a subsequent film, a subsequent color film, some of which was most likely shot in Santa Fe, given the presence of Franciscan monks in the parade, as well as in area pueblos, and then back at the ceremonial in Gallup. The juxtaposition of Native American culture with patriotic Americana in the Santa Fe footage, red, white, and blue flags are ubiquitous, is a reminder of the temporal proximity of the historical backdrop of genocide, colonialism, and imperialism to the historical moment of the film. Rather returns to film the parade, shooting from a location on Route 66 and 3rd Street, a spot that yields stunning footage, and he was in the exact same spot in some of the black and white footage, maximizing the parade's singularity as a moving panorama of Indigenous resilience and survival. The sheer number of participants wearing elaborate regalia and body paint remind us not only of the cultural significance of ceremonial, but also a palpable sense of how thrilling it must have been to take part. The parade is a sea of color rendered in tones reminiscent of the hand-tinted works of 19th century lantern slides and early cinema. The novelty value of the color footage of ceremonial is therefore informed by several layers of cultural meaning, some pertaining to Indigenous traditions, others to the role of color in the popular arts and the iconography of the Southwest. I'll just let this run out, and I can best date this to the early 1930s. Clip to an extreme long shot of the New Mexico landscape, followed by a brief return to the earlier dancing, does not prepare us for the sudden transition to a 3-shot sequence of an empty landscape, followed by a fenced-in ranch and a shot of Rather's daughters on their ponies drifting across the frame. Before we have time to process what we've just seen, we jump back to the original, this possible shot in Santa Fe parade, now in a 3rd location with footage of musicians, a mule wagon, and goats. The footage of the girls, though, is a stark reminder that we are watching home movies after all, rather than any official rendition of ceremonial. But given how much of the color footage is given up to Indigenous culture, the film's center of gravity shifts away from that of family chronicler to Indigenous memory keeper or history maker, with Rather unofficially co-opted into this role as the film's meaning shifts over time. Part 4, Cinema as Memoryscape, the Gallup interviews. I screened excerpts from Rather's 2 films and Camping Among the Indians, the Museum of Natural History film from 1927, to community members at the Octavia Phelan Public Library in the fall of 2021. 2 of the interviews were conducted in person and 2 of them over Zoom. Some of the participants were Native, others were not, and the groups ranged from 2 to 4 persons. The interviews fell into the broad category of recovery work, an attempt to indigenize the historical archive by focusing upon what Joanna Hearn calls Indigenous media genealogies. Similar to the method of photo elicitation devised by anthropologist John Collier in 1957, a variation on open-ended interviewing in which the exchange between interviewer and participant is guided by images created by either party or from an external/historical source. The films encouraged reminiscing about ceremonial among the respondents, although the reactions differed significantly based on whether the subjects interviewed were Native, identified with Indigenous identity as a result of community involvement, or had professional or business ties to the ceremonial. As expert witnesses and animated storytellers, the respondents took their roles as gatekeepers of the memory of ceremonial very seriously. The film's existence after almost a century was a point of great interest, and many respondents expressed delight that filmmakers and photographs had taken the effort to record ceremonial. There were broad smiles and chuckles at this deep cinematic history of ceremonial, wonderment that films from its earliest years had miraculously survived, and broad agreement that they were evidence of cultural survival, resilience, and continuity. But there were other reactions, suggesting that cinema, like divergent memories of a specific event, will be made sense of depending on a slew of psychosocial variables: who we are, what we think, and how we define ourselves. In a nutshell, Rather's films touched a nerve for some people. Several respondents underscored the fact that the dances taking up considerable screen time in Rather's films were social dances rather than religious dances, desanctified for public presentation, and not the same as those done during feast days. Diné activist, son of a Navajo code talker, a New Mexico Social Justice and Equity Institute board member, Larry P. Foster, pointed out that for a period, Diné dances at the summer ceremonial featured sacred yebiche dances, used when a sick person needs healing, in which a white clay called glache was painted onto the body. This practice, Foster pointed out, was highly irregular. Quote, so when they perform like that, you have to pray and sing. There's a medicine man involved in that. You can't just go out and do that yourself. There's a consequence to that. You might lose your eyesight, end quote. Diné member Mattie Y. Foster of Mentmore, New Mexico, married to Larry Foster, later lent weight to his criticism, adding that, quote, it's not for a show, you know. The spots that they make on their skin, you're not supposed to be among people. You're supposed to say sacred by yourself. You can't sleep with your spouse or anybody until the patient, she gets healed. That's a time just to cleanse yourself through the sweat lodge, end quote. For Larry and Mattie Foster, tactics for desanctifying the dances, including attaching symbolic objects such as eagle feathers to the wrong parts of the body, were inadequate to avoid the sacrilegious implications of including yebiche dancers at the ceremonial. Of course, the respondents were fully cognizant of the historically contingent nature of information about dance authorization, the fact that we can only speculate about the process of gaining permission from the medicine men. As Larry noted, quote, there must have been, meetings among their leaders, their spiritual leaders, medicine men to approve that, to bring over here, and to try to put it into the form of a social performance, end quote. Whether the Diné participants felt pressure from colonial authorities to dance, and whether they would have agreed if the dance had been deemed taboo, transgressive, or dangerous, are valid questions, a reminder of the complex intercultural context surrounding these films. Larry also took umbrage at the desacralized Apache Gan dance from Camping Among the Indians, misidentified in intertitles as an Apache devil dance, rather than a dance in honor of the spirits that lived in nearby mountains. Gan dances continued to be performed in non-sacred spaces, such as the New Mexico State Fair, into the 1970s, suggesting a certain mutability around their meaning, meant for one context and re-signified in another. Continuing his train of thought, Larry wondered if the sacred eagle feathers worn by dancers had been the subject of discussion, perhaps involving, quote, meetings among their spiritual leaders, medicine men to approve that and to bring it over here, end quote. This corroborates Diné writer Irene Stewart's criticism that some medicine men had become unscrupulous over time, shedding ancient beliefs and transforming ceremonies into public shows to gain profits instead of for healing purposes. Opening up about the ceremonial's history and memory provoked all manner of personal disclosures, such as Gallup archaeologist, historian, and author Martin Link's admission that back in the 1950s at ceremonial, quote, you could wear a headdress even though you weren't a Plains Indian, And then all the white people, immediately they'd recognize me as an Indian or accept me as an Indian if I wore a headdress, end quote. Gallup's carnivalesque and heterotopic atmosphere, like that of the Wild West show and the midways of World's Fairs, brought center and periphery into collision, with tourists travel to Gallup, unleashing the imaginative capacities of middle-class Americans. Cinema served as an adjunct provocateur for Indigenous people eager to construct a counter-narrative of the ceremonial. At the same time, the film's elicitation of the pleasures of recollection of past stories and articulations of selfhood brought lightness and moments of joy and pride to the conversation as well. However, for Maddie Foster, watching films of the ceremonial compared her to share a traumatic story with a voice reminiscent of what Anishinaabe scholar Gerald Vizenor calls survivance, defined by an active sense of presence. Triggered perhaps by a moment in camping among the Indians when an Anglo woman seen here puts both hands on the shoulder of a small Indian girl, Maddie shared an early memory of attending the ceremonial with her mother, who spoke only Diné. The story recalled an Anglo woman who befriended them both, asking the mother whether she could take the little girl as part of an impromptu adoption. Quote, "She almost take me, that lady," Maddie recounted, adding that, quote, "if my mom had said yes, I would have been somewhere else," end quote. This memory, a metonymy for the US government's forceful removal of Native American children to boarding schools where they suffered emotional, verbal, and physical abuse, underscores the role of film in affirming cultural survival, albeit through the activation of memories that lie beneath its surface. What Maddie's psychic re-entry into the world of the ceremonial via the films made obvious was the fact that the films don't simply represent space and culture, but a reliving of experience in a hybrid public-private realm. What Dutch media scholar Josie van Dijk terms mediated memories, sites of struggle or negotiation. According to Van Dijk, quote, has there ever been a sharp distinction between public and private, since every act of memory involves a negotiation of the boundaries between these two spheres, end quote. Interlinking past and present, these amateur films of the ceremonial functioned as an intermediary between an individual and a culture, invoking the sensory ambience and emotional landscape of distinct memories tethered to the filmmaker as a seeing subject, but also enfolded into transcendent memories of Gallup that are simultaneously public and private. The idea of Gallup as a memoryscape, Mark Nuttall's term for the sensual and mental apprehension of environment he developed in conjunction with the Inuit of northwestern Greenland, where technologically mediated memories of an absent filmmaker transmogrify into public and second-level personal memories, is a fitting heuristic for making sense of the ceremonial as bound to a specific place. But beyond the oral history interview, how might amateur films of the ceremonial activate historical memory within a framework of community engagement and regeneration, where the films might assume new meaning and relevance? How can the power of place serve as a mnemonic for Native American lifeways, culture, and history? By way of a brief conclusion, I explore how Raba's films and others from the era may or may not be recuperated as part of a broader civic mission of social engagement, and the paradoxical nature of film as memory and memory as film. Part 5, Indigenous Futures Reimagining Amateur Film. There are no rules about how a community might become engaged with archival films, and I saw expressions of excitement as well as reticence in the small group of people I interviewed. The broader question of how William Rather's films might contribute to Native American modalities of, quote, doing history, end quote, references to rituals that are enmeshed in mythologizing narratives, what Alfonso Ortiz sees as processes of anchoring social events onto symbolic vehicles of expression, that are traditional and that lock these events comfortably onto their own cultural landscape is intriguing. And some of my respondents had definite ideas about what should be done with these films. For example, Terry Fraser, a Laguna Hopi woman who is director of the Gallup Cultural Center. You can see her on my Zoom, a frame grab of my Zoom interview with her here. She oversees the evenings of Indian dances in Gallup during the summer season, during ceremonial. And her great-grandmother participated in the 1922 ceremonial. She had few problems imagining ways of re-signifying these films. The way I see it, she said, this is a true history of the event, and that it should be perpetuated in a way that honors it. She felt that the task of ensuring a future for the films should fall on the shoulders of current participants, some of whom were the 7th or 8th generation to take part in ceremonial. Quote, I believe that it's them that approaches the tribe to say, this is what we want to keep as part of our tribal archives, end quote. She imagined films like Camping Among the Indians or Rather's Home Movies being projected at the Gallup Cultural Center, which she directs, with contemporary Ola maidens dancing in front of them and reacting to the footage of their historical counterparts. This melding of past and present through dance and cinema would then be filmed so that future generations could re-encounter and renegotiate the meanings of ceremonial from its earliest days. Quote, that's a treasure right there, she said, referring to the film, as well as the possibility of a reimagining it in a new context. Quote, because you're getting the true reaction of what they remember and even possibly what could be in the future, end quote. Compared to contemporary video of the ceremonial, the truth value of the archival films was significantly higher for Fraser. Back then, she noted, it was really legit. A reference to both the ceremonial and the filmmaking. Then by osmosis, she argued, it starts becoming a bit more commercialized and a little bit more commercialized. And then we're where we are today, where film is valuable, but not in a way it was in the past, which is the legitimacy of what our culture was. What we film today is the product of what colonialism and tourism and everything has produced now. It's a show now. It's how bright can my feathers be? It's entertainment, end quote. As examples of mediated memories, films are imbricated in complex constellations of race, culture, identity, place, and narrative. Their meanings as much up for grabs today as they were in the 1920s and 30s. Exploring how affect and issues of rights around archival film, both in a legal and social justice sense, are mutually constituted, might help us better understand how watching films invokes self-referencing, a process in which incoming information from a viewing experience is both elaborated on and compared to someone's own memory. The affordances between film and memory are fluid, formal, and effective, and while images themselves cannot narrate experience, individuals can, partaking in what Martha Langford calls performative viewing. Moreover, remembering and expressing, as well as forgetting and repressing, are, as anthropologist Linda Manick argues, part and parcel of the myriad emotions involved in looking at archival images, sensual memories attributed not only to the visual track, but also triggered by olfactory, auditory, and as Proust famously observed in Swann's Way, gustatory cues. Seeing ceremonial through the lens of amateur footage is a complex act of reimagining, one in which original seeing subjects, while never entirely deracinated, step aside for new interlocutors. The respondents I interviewed were not the only community members to watch the films. Since during the ceremonial centennial in 2022, excerpts from the films were shown on a loop as part of a temporary exhibit commemorating the 100th ceremonial curated by Tammy Moe and her team at the Rex Theatre. Along with the interview transcripts, the films are permanently archived now at the library for anyone in the community to access and watch. New meanings doubtless accrued as community members and tourists saw the history of the ceremonial in moving image form for the first time. The past preserved, but always subject to revision, reimagining, and to collective as well as individual memories. Like photographs and souvenirs, home movies serve to sanction, validate, and even question memories, serving as the visual equivalent of summative statements on experiences, spaces, and fleeting or lasting impressions. But Rather's films are also surprisingly deft at capturing the messy intersubjectivities of Native Americans and Euro-Americans, and hold vital clues for reimagining the film archive as a site of counter-memory, less a seal vault than an untapped vein of potential new beginnings. In contrast to the land of enchantment trope defining much of the promotional materials related to the ceremonial and wider tourism of the region, the home movie footage shot by Rather invites a more dialogic, sensorially evocative sense of what it must have been like to attend the ceremonial between 1926, its fourth year, and 1932, the time span of William Rather's films and Camping Among the Indians, foregrounding a bifurcated gaze that looks inwards at his family, but more dynamically and more significantly for my project, outwards at the Indigenous celebration. Rather's camera pivots erratically from chronicling his family's vacation, that includes touring pueblos, taking rubbings of petroglyphs, horseback riding against the backdrop of the dramatic landscape, to the parades, dances, and competitions of the ceremonial. By turning the camera on his family, Rather submits them to a similar process of reification, not unlike that of the First Peoples, while paradoxically constructing them as prototypical Euro-American tourists that flock to the Southwest and that are parodied in this early 20th century cartoon. Rather's films are remarkably open texts that have transmuted from their original hybrid quasi-newsreel / home movie status into archival records that hold value for Native American communities. Cinema's ability to act upon the senses, to evoke the act of looking through panning and camera reframing, and in the amateur film especially, to include all manner of small mistakes such as jump cuts, objects, or people obstructing the view, and awkward moments of subjects' objections to being films, are less markers of authenticity than recognition of the underlying artifice and constructed nature of reality. That said, the amateurishness of Rather's films is what creates discursive space for rethinking how they might hold clues for more complicated history of the Gallup ceremonial, as well as their value today, either as raw material for compilation films or for compilation filmmakers, or screenings for the local community in the Gallup Cultural Center or Red Rock Museum. Stored for decades in an unused bathtub in William Rather's grandson's bathroom before being donated by Rather's daughter, Catherine Rather, to the New Mexico State Register Center. They then ended up at the National Anthropological Archive. These films represent a fraction of the vast number of amateur films shot at the Gallup ceremonial during its first decades. In addition, as Catherine Rather explained to former National Anthropological Archive curator Pamela Wintle, and I should just add the National Anthropological Archive is part of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., Rather made several other films, including a trip to Ethiopia, but because of water damage from a backed up garbage disposal, these films were degraded beyond rescue. The ceremonial then is a unique and formidable subject for film historians. It's hard to estimate how many hours of amateur footage must have been shot over the years, with more recent celebrations shared on YouTube and Instagram. Let's just take a look at one of these that I found on YouTube. This film is from about 2018. It's about 5 years ago. The corpus of films made over the years constitute a longitudinal study of Native American self-determination in the context of the ceremonial, as well as possibilities for counter-narratives. As a latecomer to the serious arts, what Susan Sontag saw as cinema's ability to raid and deploy even relatively stale elements in innumerable fresh combinations, cinema fused dance, music in the sound era, architecture, and photography. Although black and white film could hardly do justice to the explosion of color at the ceremonial, something rather may have instinctively understood and sought to counter when he used color film footage, color film stock in the early 1930s. How we interpret the visual archive of the ceremonial depends not only on a triangulation of information from different stakeholders, but also upon a transvaluation of how we interpret that information, most radically by bringing in perspectives that complicate received wisdom on its historical meaning almost a century later. Inspired by Native American poet Ron Welburn's questioning of whose hands is the telling of the tale, we might think of Rather's films as possessing far greater value for Native Americans than for his own descendants, their use value shifting over the passage of time and subject to new interpretations in oral history interviews. And thank you very much for listening to my lecture. I will now pass things back over to Kathleen.
Thank you very much, Alison. That was great. All that visual material, those films were wonderful. I'd love to ask you a couple of questions, particularly since this is pre-recorded, and so our normally the audience would ask questions, but I will try to speak on their behalf. And I've done a little bit of background to prep for this, and looking at your past books and projects, your work seems literally all over the map. You've done the American Southwest and the project in Norway, Australia. I think you were in Central Asia at one point. You've got a broad array of topics, explorers and expedition films. There was something about prison communities and medieval visual culture. How do you choose where you're going to do stuff and what topic is worth investigating? It seems like there is so much film in the world. How do you pick what's next?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I'm really interested in cinema as just one potential way of documenting reality in relation to other kind of, objects such as maps, medieval visual objects, artworks, etc. So I have a very, very broad approach to my subject matters. And I'm always interested in sort of approaching things from the margins. I mean, not looking at sort of mainstream Hollywood film, but also always thinking about cinema in relation to unusual spaces. So cinema in museums, cinema in schools, cinema in carceral settings, cinema in private clubs. And amateur film has always fascinated me. I'm very excited by the way in which we can think about cinema as a kind of a memory machine. And so in a lot of my projects, I'm often pulled to the very edges, literally the kind of edges of continents, et cetera, to kind of think about what might be some of the earliest films that document a particular culture. So I think culture is a through line in a lot of my work. My earliest book was really about how anthropology and cinema came into contact with one another, how one could enhance and service and be of use to the other. And so, some of the earliest films made of Indigenous peoples were made in Australia, Central Asia, were made literally in very far-flung places. So I think, yes, I could go on at length because this is a really generative question, but I'm just very interested in thinking about cinema as an instructive, very sensory, very evocative, a medium that is far more than something that simply entertains us. So this sort of nonfiction, educational, added value that cinema can bring to the conversation is something that I think has fascinated me for many decades.
Great. You mentioned in the beginning that this was part of an investigation of Indigenous media and history across a number of peoples, the
Mm.
American Southwest and the Sami and Australia. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Where's that headed? Where are you
Yeah.
going with all this?
Yeah. So I'm interested in looking at three geographically separate, remote, but sort of politically, ideologically connected settler colonial contexts. And so I'm interested in thinking about cinema, some of the earliest representations of these communities and different ways in which films made of these communities can be returned to them. So some of the work that I presented today is just a small kind of sample of ways in which I'm looking at a specific event in the case of the American Southwest, and exploring how these films can be returned to communities, can become part of their sort of Indigenous culture, and how these films can be reused. I mean, I think in some ways, a lot of Indigenous artists are interested in sort of taking back or creating new historical meanings, thinking about sort of new archival imaginaries. And so, I won't be replicating the same kind of work in each of these contexts, but there's a great deal of similarity. In all of these places, Indigenous people were dominated by majority cultures. We have traditions of boarding schools, we have traditions of language suppression, persecution, etc., among each of these peoples. So there's something that ties them in terms of their very, very painful and very traumatic life histories. So what I'm trying to do is to see how these films might be considered part of their audio cultural visual heritage. All right, we normally think of things like beautiful masks or other kinds of Indigenous artifacts and material culture that's often been taken from communities, is then returned to them so that they can be properly cared for, and Indigenous people can become part of that caretaking responsibility. I'm asking how films might be considered part of that material in some ways. Now, films are tricky objects because these films were not made by Indigenous people. The films that I'm looking at, these films were made by representatives of the majority culture. And so they both contain incredible, rich evidence of cultural resilience and survival, but they're also difficult objects. So yes, I have spent 4 months at the National Library of Norway looking at the earliest films they have of Sami peoples from about 1905, also looking at Sami film at the National Library in Stockholm and also at the National Audiovisual Institute in Helsinki, because the Sami people cross actual 4 countries, including Russia too. So yes, this project is early days, but it will result, I hope, in a book about media history and Indigenous cultural memory, and I hope be a kind of a handbook of sort for other communities thinking about how they might turn to archival film to use it to create more equitable, socially just histories of Indigenous people that include their voices and include their perspectives, because I'm simply a conduit for trying to return this material, really.
That's actually something. So much of your research seems to include older films, and how do you find yourself trying to get close to the subjects across the decades, across the cultures? Do you bring in, you brought in the other people for oral history, but are you bringing, I don't know, research support from Indigenous peoples, or
Yeah.
how do you get to what
Right.
this material means?
Right. So, as part of this real push to kind of decolonize the archive, we need to involve Indigenous people as far as possible. And so with the project that I presented today, a lot of the archival research and some of the interviews that were not featured today, but will be featured in a much bigger chapter that I'm still working on. I was very lucky to win a grant from the Waterhouse Family Institute for Society and Communication. And so I was able to hire a Dene doctoral student in anthropology at UNM called Kendrick McCabe. And this was also during COVID. I won the grant in August of 2020. And so it was impossible for me to travel to archives in the Southwest. But with Kendrick being there, he was able to do just amazing work and was able to consult archives once they slowly started to open. And what Kendrick did too was do interviews with a lot of the tradespeople and just literally walking in and out of some of the stores in Gallup. So I have a whole second collection of interviews that I haven't yet turned to. I did these interviews which involved looking specifically at the films, but it was invaluable. I mean, this research would not really have been able to have been completed without the support of someone like Kendrick, whose own family lives very close, and who's very interested himself in kind of Dene visual history and visual culture. In the case of the films in the Sapmi region in northern Scandinavia, I've been looking at ways of seeing how Sami artists have turned to these films and incorporated them into their own research. There's a wonderful film from 1915 that is of a Sami family, and I met a descendant of that family whose great-grandmother is in that film and who passed away tragically from a goiter the following year. And she's made a film called Ask the Foremothers, in which she reconstructs that awful story of her grandmother passing away while she was 8 months pregnant, and also incorporates some of this archival film. So that's another kind of practice that I'm interested in, how artists turn to these films, and use them to create new memories, and to also demonstrate that the archive, far from being dusty, irrelevant, just sort of permanently buried, is very much a space of hope. I think it's also a space of pain, and I think for some Indigenous people there's a real ambivalence about looking at some of these films, which can be incredibly challenging to look at. There's a big collection of films in the National Library of Oslo, made by members of the Lutheran mission in Norway. And these films, which were made as early as the 1920s, are very, very painful reminders of colonialism. And there's no easy way to just imagine from an outsider how hard it must be for community members to watch some of these films. And then the Australian research, I have seen a great deal of films, but this part of the research is in a very early stage in terms of collaborators. And I'm looking to hopefully be able to hire researchers, become connected to community members, because there are very clear protocols about how to go about writing about some of these films. They are incredible, but I will not publish or write about them until I have people who are representatives of the communities from which the films were made, Indigenous Australians, to help me find ways of sort of thinking about them and reconnecting them to the communities who I think rightfully should now become their caretakers.
Yes. So when the book that you're mostly done with, Nomadic Cinema, when's that wrap up? When's that due out?
Yeah, I'm just finishing up with the final round of copy edits on that book, and that should be out, I'd say, summer of 2024. Okay. would be my goal. And for anyone here who's been following, I guess, some of the calamities that have been taking place on Mount Everest, I have a chapter in that book which looks at the earliest films made of 3 British attempts on Mount Everest in 1922 and 1924. And it's an extraordinary story of cinema literally pushed to its extreme, and attempts to take cinema to the top of the world. It's an amazing story, and I have some pretty interesting case studies on how cinema was used as a tool of exploration, mostly in the first 30 years of the 20th century, during the so-called golden age of exploration. So yeah, and even some medieval visual material in that book as well. Cool. So that was very, very fun to write.
Sometime mid next year then. So then it sounds like this one on the indigenous peoples are a little bit further out. Is that?
It is, yes. I mean, so I now have to take a little break from that to finish up my edits, but hopefully by January I can move into that project. A couple of things, a couple of chapters. I'd say about 3 chapters are done. It's maybe about a third done. But this is a book that needs to be done very carefully, very thoughtfully, and it has to be done very slowly, I believe, just because I can't just squirrel myself away and just write all these chapters. I really do need Indigenous collaborators to help me. And so it's been very productive being based in Norway, where I was able to do interviews with Sami artists. And that was very successful. And so, yes, the library itself is embarking on a huge grant to try and indigenize some of its metadata about these films. So that includes Sami names for things, knowledge, and lifeways into the information, so that people around the world can access these films and get a much better sense of what they mean from a Sami perspective. So yes, that's projects are always back burner, front burner, kind of moving back and forth. Things are kind of in various stages depending on, where I'm giving talks or what the schedule is. But
plus, there's classes to teach,
and there are classes to teach as well. But no, it's been really thrilling working on the Gallup material. It was almost serendipitous. As part of my research into expedition films, I discovered this one film, Camping Among the Indians, and realized that the second half of it was shot at Ceremonial, and then was at the National Anthropological Archives and found more films. That's where I found Rather's films and some other films of Ceremonial as well, and realized that, wow, these might be some of the first films that were ever made of this extraordinary event that I was so blown away by I was there for about 5 days last summer, and it's just amazing. And yes, I think these films capture something really quite special. Yes, thank you for the opportunity to share this work.
Well, so this lecture is pre-recorded, so our audience can't ask questions, but I'm hoping that if someone sends an email that they can reach out to you if there's follow-on questions here.
Absolutely, yes. You can email me via my website, www.mynamealisongriffiths.org. There's a contact there, or you can just Google my name, and somewhere on that first page should be my Baruch College, my academic affiliation, and my email is alison.griffiths@baruch.cuny.edu. So I'm pretty easy to reach via email. So yeah, feel free to send me questions, reactions, suggestions, ideas. I'd be very happy to receive them.
Great, thank you. Any last comments as we wrap up, Alison?
Gosh, I hope everybody makes it to Ceremonial. That's starting very soon. Unfortunately, I'm unable to come this year. I hope it's not too hot, but it is an absolute treat. I cannot recommend it more highly enough. And yes, and the Octavia Phelan Public Library has an incredible visual archive of materials relating to ceremonials, incredible legacy, and Gallup is a super fun place to go visit. So a shout out for Gallup. But it's been really fun.
All right. Well, thank you again, Allison. This was excellent. The films and your discussion, just wonderful material. Thank you.
Thank you
For
so
our
much.
audience-
All my pleasure.
Thanks. For our audience, in closing, a reminder to visit our website at friendsofhistorynm.org, where you can rewatch this lecture and other Friends of History First Wednesday lectures. Click on the lecture series link at the top of the page, then past lectures to see the list. If you wish to learn more about our upcoming lectures or more broadly about the Friends of History, we encourage you to join our mailing list or email us at nmhmfriendsofhistory@gmail.com. Finally, we request that you consider making a donation to Friends of History, no matter the size, through our website, so that the Friends of History can continue to support programs at the New Mexico History Museum. And thank you to all of you who have been contributing to the Friends of History over these last several years. We look forward to seeing you in the coming months. Thank you and goodbye.